In late December, something familiar and yet dangerously different returned to Iran. What began as scattered protests over inflation and a collapsing currency quickly transformed into something far more radical: open calls for regime change. This was no longer just about prices, it was about power, identity, and exhaustion. At least 2,000 people are now estimated to have been killed. Communications were cut, the internet went dark, and still people stayed in the streets. Here is the mistake many observers make. They see this as Iran's problem alone. It isn't. Iran sits at the center of the Middle East security architecture. When it shakes, the region moves with it. Israel watches with hope and fear. Gulf states stay quiet but alert. Hezbollah feels the ground shifting beneath its feet. Turkey calculates the risks of chaos versus opportunity. If you want to understand where the Middle East may be heading next, you have to start here. Stay with me, because to understand what this moment really means, we need to step back and define the problem clearly. What is happening in Iran right now is not a single event. It is a collision of pressures that have been building for years, economic, political, and strategic, finally breaking the surface at the same time. The protests began with bread and butter issues: inflation, currency collapse, daily survival, but they quickly crossed a dangerous threshold. When slogans shift from reform to regime change, the nature of the crisis changes completely. At that point, the system itself becomes the target. This is why the response from Tehran has been so brutal. Internet blackouts are not about security alone, they are about controlling narrative, isolating citizens, and buying time. Violence is not a failure of the system, it is one of its tools. Yet this crisis cannot be understood by looking inward alone. Iran is not just a country, it is a hub. Its money, weapons, and ideology flow outward to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis. Domestic instability in Iran instantly becomes a regional variable, and every major actor in the Middle East knows it. To understand why this moment feels different, and why expectations are being cautiously restrained, we have to look backward, not forward. To understand why Iran's streets have erupted again, and why the stakes now feel higher, we need to look at the deeper structure of the system itself. For decades, the Islamic Republic built its survival strategy on two pillars. The first was internal control, a fusion of ideology, security forces, and fear. The second was external projection, exporting influence through proxies to shape the region and keep enemies far from its borders. This model worked until it became too expensive. Sanctions tightened, oil revenues shrank, the currency collapsed, inflation hollowed out the middle class, and yet the regime continued to spend billions beyond its borders, funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and armed groups elsewhere. The social contract at home quietly broke. History matters here. Iranians remember a different era. Before 1979, before isolation, when the country was integrated into global systems and living standards were higher. That memory never disappeared. It waited. Over time, economic grievances fused with political ones. Each protest cycle ended in repression, but each left behind more anger, less fear, and a population increasingly willing to test the limits again. That accumulation, slow, structural, and irreversible, is what brought Iran to this point. And then something snapped. Then came the moment when tension turned into rupture. As protests spread from city to city, the regime responded not with reform, but with force. Security units flooded the streets, live ammunition replaced warnings, the internet went dark, not accidentally but deliberately. This was not crowd control, this was survival mode. The numbers are hard to verify in an information blackout, but human rights groups now estimate that at least 2,000 people have been killed, thousands more arrested, families left without answers. In modern Iran, this scale of violence marks a line that cannot be erased. Here is why this moment matters. When a state uses mass violence against its own citizens, it signals weakness as much as strength. It reveals fear at the top and a belief that compromise is no longer an option. And yet the protesters did not disappear. Economic slogans turned political. Political slogans turned existential. The message was no longer change policy, it was change the system. If you're trying to understand whether this uprising is different, this is the inflection point you should watch. Moments like this reshape trajectories, and they force us to ask a harder question: what kind of system responds this way and why? If this analysis helps you see the region more clearly, stay with me, because next we need to uncover what's really holding this system together. What sustains the Islamic Republic is not ideology alone. It is a carefully engineered mechanism of control. At its core is a security state built for endurance. Loyal forces, parallel chains of command, economic privileges tied directly to obedience. Power is not just enforced, it is distributed selectively, creating stakeholders in repression itself. But there is another layer, less visible and more strategic. External conflict has long been used to justify internal sacrifice. When the nation is under threat, dissent becomes betrayal. Resources are redirected outward. Accountability dissolves inward. This is where Iran's regional network matters. Support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and other proxies is not only about influence abroad, it is about legitimacy at home. The regime presents itself as the guardian of resistance, even as daily life deteriorates for ordinary Iranians. The problem is that this mechanism is now misfiring. Economic collapse has stripped the narrative of credibility. When people can no longer afford food, slogans about regional power ring hollow. When citizens chant that their lives should be spent on Iran, not Gaza, not Lebanon, the system's moral logic breaks. What remains is force, and force alone is never a stable foundation. This is the paradox of the moment. The very tools that kept the system alive are now accelerating its exposure. And that leads directly to the next escalation. Because when control weakens, crises don't fade, they multiply. As the pressure mounts at home, the danger shifts outward. History shows that regimes under stress often look for distraction, not necessarily war, but tension. A crisis elsewhere that changes the conversation, rallies loyalists, and reminds the world that destabilizing Iran carries a price. This is why the regional context matters so much right now. Iran's influence has already been weakened. The Islamic State is no longer the dominant threat it once was. Hamas and Hezbollah have suffered serious military setbacks. Syria, once Iran's key corridor, has slipped from its firm control. And during the recent 12-day war, Iran absorbed blows it could not easily answer. That combination is combustible. There are real fears that Iran could activate its remaining levers, not because it wants escalation, but because escalation may seem preferable to humiliation. Hezbollah in particular becomes a variable, a provocation, a message, a distraction from the streets of Tehran. The irony is this: the more Iran relies on these tools, the more exposed it becomes. Each proxy move risks retaliation. Each escalation invites consequences the regime is less able to absorb. This is no longer a system managing risk. It is a system improvising under stress. And when systems improvise, ordinary people far from the centers of power pay the price, which brings us to the most important question of all. What does this moment mean for the people caught inside it? If you are watching this from the outside, it is easy to talk about strategy, leverage, and balance of power. But if you are inside this moment, everything feels different. For ordinary Iranians, this crisis is not abstract. It is personal. It is the cost of food doubling while wages collapse. It is parents choosing between medicine and rent. It is young people realizing that no matter how hard they work, the future keeps shrinking. And now, layered on top of that, comes fear. Fear of arrest. Fear of silence. Fear that speaking once will cost everything. Yet people still go out, not because they believe victory is guaranteed, but because the alternative feels unbearable. And if you are watching from Lebanon, this moment carries a different kind of weight. Many Lebanese know exactly what it means to live under the shadow of an armed proxy. They hear Iranian protesters chanting against funding Hezbollah, and they understand why. This is what systems forget. Pressure does not disappear. It transfers, it accumulates, it hardens people. If this analysis resonates with you, if you feel the human cost behind the headlines, share it. These stories only matter if they are heard, because what happens next will not stay contained. It never does, and that takes us beyond borders to the global consequences already forming. What happens inside Iran does not stay inside Iran because Iran is woven into too many fault lines. Israel is watching closely. For decades, Iran has been at the center of its security doctrine, nuclear ambitions, missile programs, and proxy warfare. The possibility of regime change creates hope, but also deep caution. Israelis remember how often revolutionary moments produce outcomes worse than expected. A weakened Iran could mean opportunity. A chaotic Iran could mean danger. Across the Gulf, silence is strategic. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar understand the risks of miscalculation. Public support for protesters could invite retaliation. Yet privately, they are recalibrating. A weaker Iran changes energy security, regional diplomacy, and proxy behavior. Stability matters more to them than ideology. Turkey faces a different dilemma. Chaos in Iran could mean refugees, Kurdish unrest, and border instability. But a diminished Iran also clears space for Ankara's ambitions from Syria to broader regional leadership. This is how regional systems shift, not with announcements but with quiet adjustments. Each capital is preparing for multiple outcomes at once, because everyone understands the same truth. Iran is no longer just projecting power. It is absorbing shock, and when a central node weakens, the entire network feels it. The future of Iran, its fate, its regime, and its role in the Middle East will not be written in a vacuum. It will be shaped by the forces that surround it and the choices that Iran makes in the coming months. Let's imagine three possible futures. The best-case scenario: Iran, under immense internal pressure, finds a path to reform. The regime softens its approach. It opens up political space, addressing economic grievances and delivering basic freedoms to the people. There is some degree of reconciliation, perhaps with a new leadership emerging, one that seeks a less confrontational foreign policy. If Iran moves in this direction, it could see a return to greater stability, a reduction in regional tensions, and even a tentative reintegration into the global community. For Israel, the Gulf states, and Lebanon, this would be a chance to rebuild trust and lessen the specter of conflict. A peaceful Iran would be a game changer for everyone. The middle path: Iran struggles through this crisis without collapsing, but it never fully resolves the underlying issues. The regime might survive, but weakened, more isolated, and unable to regain the trust of its people. Protests continue, periodically erupting as frustrations simmer beneath the surface. Regionally, Iran may remain engaged in proxy wars, but with less capacity. This kind of unstable equilibrium would leave the Middle East on edge. Israel and the Gulf would continue their cautious engagement with Tehran, always aware that things could tip in any direction. The worst-case scenario: the protests do succeed in toppling the regime, an outcome that leaves Iran in chaos. There's a vacuum of power and competing factions vie for control. The regime's collapse could spark a civil war, destabilizing not just Iran but much of the surrounding region. Kurdish militias, Sunni groups, and the Revolutionary Guards could all seek to carve out influence. In this scenario, the Gulf states and Israel would find themselves dealing with an unpredictable, possibly hostile neighbor. The region's energy markets would face volatility. Oil shipments would be at risk, and the fear of a nuclear-armed Iran would remain, perhaps even more urgent than before. Each of these futures is plausible, but none is guaranteed. What's clear is that Iran's future will have profound consequences for the rest of the region. and perhaps beyond. As we close, we are left with more questions than answers. But that is the essence of this moment: uncertainty, tension, and potential. The Iranian protests are not just a domestic issue, they are a signal to the entire Middle East. The region is already in flux, and Iran's crisis could be the catalyst for a deeper transformation. The protests may mark the end of one era or the beginning of another. Israel, the Gulf states, Lebanon, and Turkey all have their hopes and fears tied to what happens in Iran. Each of them is navigating a fragile balance, calculating risks and adjusting to what is unfolding. The outcome of this movement could reshape not just Iran's future, but the very contours of the Middle East. For now, we wait and watch. And we understand one thing: no matter how this ends, the effects will be profound. The story of the Iranian protests has only just begun to unfold. Stay tuned, because the world is watching. Take action, share this analysis, because understanding these shifts is key to shaping the future. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Let's see where this leads.